My word is photography, which is spelled P-H-O-T-O-G-R-A-P-H-Y. Okay, photography is a familiar, even over-familiar reality. Many of us have at least one camera. We share images on social media sites at the click of a button. So it is perhaps easy to forget that photography is a relatively recent invention. It certainly wasn't as commonplace in the 19th century as it is today, and it certainly also wasn't taken for granted. The word photography is credited to Sir John Herschel, who was a preeminent scientist and mathematician of the 19th century. And he used the word for the first time, as far as we know, in a paper addressed to the Royal Society in London in March 1839. The etymology of the word photography derives from two Greek words, photos, which means light, and graphos, which means writing. So photography translates literally as light writing. The inventors didn't actually use the word photography. They used words including their names to describe the process, for example, daguerreotype or talbotype, or words that included terms like light and sun. And there are four main techniques. The first photograph, which is a heliograph from Helios, sun, was taken by Nicephore Niepce in 1826 or 27. So the very long exposure time of up to 8 hours of this particular image results in an image with no shadows. And it shows how the early photographic material had relatively low light sensitivity. The invention of photography was in fact the fruitful encounter of two different fields, optics and chemistry. So the next process is the daguerreotype, invented by Louis Daguerre, another Frenchman. And the daguerreotype is an image that is associated with the invention of photography, although as an image it has relatively little to do with photography as we understand it now. It was a unique positive image, a silver-coated copper plate. The daguerreotype has a mirror effect. It was called the mirror with a memory. Now, the early reactions to daguerreotypes and to the invention of photography were generally ones of bewilderment and wonder, and photography, especially in the popular press, was often compared to magic. When photography was invented, the news spread rapidly throughout Europe, and an Englishman, William Henry Fox-Talbot, heard the news, and he himself was experimenting with photosensitive materials, and decided to also publicize his own process. The first process Talbot is associated with is the idea of photogenic drawing, which is in fact an image that is obtained without a camera. The objects are placed directly onto light-sensitive paper and exposed to sun. And perhaps the more common term for this process is the photogram. The second, much more long-lasting invention by Talbot is the negative-positive process. And this is the invention that he called talbotype, or it is also referred to as the calotype from kalos, another Greek term simply meaning beautiful. The image is first exposed onto a paper negative from which positive prints can later be made. What we have is the idea of a latent image, an image that is later developed into a positive print. Now, the big difference between a daguerreotype and a talbotype or calotype is that a daguerreotype is very sharp, which has to do with the light photons sitting on the silver copper plate. In the talbotype, the light photons are soaked into the paper, and the effect of this is a much more blurry sort of tonal gradation. Although the daguerreotype was preferred in the first decade for portraiture, the first famous portraitist of 19th century France, Felix Nadar, actually used the negative-positive process, although he used glass negatives rather than paper negatives. Nadar also wrote a memoir about his early work as a photographer, which is a very important source for photography historians. Nadar tells us about some amazing anecdotes about how people in the mid-19th century weren't used to the idea of looking at a photographic likeness of themselves. Two men come to the Nadar studio to pick up their portraits. They look at the portraits and Nadar asks them if they like their photograph. One of them wonders about the moustache and says, well, I can't remember having this moustache. Nadar looks at the photographs and realizes that they are looking at each other's photographs, and they both say yes, they quite like it, and declare themselves quite satisfied. Nadar's clients were still very wealthy people, and photography was reinvented, as it were, in 1854 for the masses. And this is the so-called carte de visite process that was patented in 1954 by another Frenchman, André Distery. The carte de visite was standardized in two ways. First of all, the format. It was usually 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches, which corresponds to the usual calling card format. But it was also standardized in terms of the iconography. The background was usually some drapery, furniture. The posing of the sitters was very similar, and the distance between the camera and the sitter made retouching redundant. So all these factors together made the carte de visite process very cheap and easy to reproduce. Now, photographs like these can be described as the beginning of celebrity culture. They were the first mass-produced image. And by the 1860s, a whole wave of cardomania broke out, which was largely due to the fact that Napoleon III had his picture taken by Distery in France, and in England, Queen Victoria had her picture taken. Certain photography studios would even provide their clients with monthly subscription, so they would get sent the carte de visite in the post. The carte de visite also had a more private function. The 1860s was the decade where images were collected in photography albums for the first time. And these type of photographs were also passed on between friends. So the use of photographs on Facebook nowadays has a precursor in these types of photographs in the 19th century.